how would you describe the state of the world?
That's a good question. How would I describe the state of the world? Well, I'm just trying to grapple with that for a second. Well, I think to first describe the state of the world, I think first needs to ask where the world is. Or you could say, is all the world experiencing the same thing all at the same time? And I think what I've found, the more that I look at that question or look at those that see the world as experiencing the same thing all at the same time at this moment, I think it becomes clear that many different peoples in many different areas are experiencing the world very differently. And I think, you know, from one lens, we see in the mainstream discourse, perhaps, we can see that there is a growing sense of impending something, whether that's those who believe there's a collapse coming of some kind, a total systems collapse. There's these others that believe there's a mass enlightenment, right? It's just on the cusp to shift humanity into this new age. And there's probably those who aren't aware of either, actually, and are sort of going along with the story as it is, and think that the story can be maintained as it has been forever. And so I think right now we're grappling with understanding what's true in all the stories. And that I think we're on the level of clear signs, we're seeing that there's very clear environmental, social, economic indicators of the breakdown of the dominant story. And for me, I really try to look at the dominant story as itself not the only story. And that there's a lot of sub-stories existing beneath the dominant story that are jostling for light and for providing a lot of meaning for certain people in certain areas of the world. And so I would say that we're approaching the limitations of the dominant story. And what I've tried to do is to look at those people who are articulating both the specifics of the challenges that we face, but then also painting some of the hints about what is to come in whatever form that might take. Because I think we're seeing the emergence of not just one new story either. We're seeing the emergence of an ecosystem of stories that are actually growing out of the dying dominant story.
So within all those continuing stories, those differing stories, do you see any underlying consistencies? Is there a core similarity, and what are the core differences as you see it?
Well, I think I'd say the dominant story, which I think is, or I should say the dominant story that posits of some sort of important shift going on. One of the main ones, which is generally accepted by the technological crowd, or those that see technology itself as this ultimate savior, is called the Singularity, which fellows like Ray Kurzweil and others have posited is humans reaching this point of artificial intelligence essentially usurping human intelligence to create exponential change. And that what that looks like for the human is, you know, for them it's bottomless. The body modification or uploading your consciousness into a computer, living forever, you know, all these types of things are all part of that story, the technological utopia. That's what I'd say is actually the dominant story for those who are still looking at it from the framework of the existing story. But then the other emerging story, umbrella story, you could say, which is more where I fall into, is the interbeing story. That we're actually starting to understand, and I would say, again, this is a very old understanding. This is a very indigenous understanding of our interconnection, both with each other and with the planet. And there's nothing that is independent. Independence itself is a myth of the perspective of the observer. That as soon as you look into it, that you realize, you know, there's this beautiful Buddhist saying, which is that the self, you try to find the self, you can't find it. And I think for a lot of Western minds, they can take that and say, oh, well, I guess somehow that means I don't exist, or somehow that means it's all an illusion. You know, the world is a projection of my mind. But they're missing a much deeper nuance there, which is that you don't exist independent of your relationships to everything else. It's a very powerful shift when somebody can see things from that perspective. And so I think, you know, people like Charles Eisenstein have articulated quite well that we're in the gap now between most of our institutions, our money system, you know, the banking system, ideas of property, you know, of human nature. They're all based upon the understanding of the independent human being making rational decisions, self-interested decisions in a universe that is fundamentally not that interested in you. And so we're in the gap now of a lot of people are starting to realize this new story of interdependence, but they don't know how to translate those into our systems yet. But we're starting to see hints in things like open source communities, permaculture, alternative currencies, decentralization. All these different types of things, to me, are need to be understood from trying to build systems based on interdependence, or the recognition of interdependence. And so that to me is the most exciting edge of what's going on right now.
So in a way, the underlying motivation behind everybody's story, do you see that as being the same motivation? Is it expansion? Is it? I won't put any word here.
Sure.
What do you see as being the core of what motivates us to keep going?
Now, would you say, like, what keeps a human going? Like,
well, let's talk about you. Let's go into purpose. What do you think of the concept of purpose?
Mm-hmm.
As an individual and as a species?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think purpose is interesting, because I think it, you know, if you look at this idea of the life purpose and self-help world has really latched onto this sense that, you know, you as an individual have a very unique and singular, or if you're lucky, maybe a couple, purposes to why you're here. And I think that's really important. It's what I've come to understand is this whole, you could call it like the psychologized self-help understanding of trying to become a whole human being is itself, I think it's really helpful at a certain point of somebody's development. That often, for people that are part of, you know, have never been able to really uncover what their gifts are, what they're good at. They've never been able to devote themselves to anything with passion or to truly love something or someone. When those types of people, they have this sort of atrophied ability to be engaged with life. And that usually means that they might be stuck in a job they hate, they might be stuck in a, you know, family dynamic which is not working, but they lack the courage and that's the fire to go and make changes, or to, you know, get out there and to follow whatever it is their dreams are. And for those times of life, it's really important to I think hear those types of messages. You know, like you can do anything. You know, you follow your bliss. You know, all this types of stuff, which is geared towards the individual self-actualizing, or the individual, you know, finding that thing, finding that life purpose. But for me, then, that's only so far. That I think once all of those are geared more towards to understanding yourself and becoming activated in some way. I'll just use the general term activated. And once you're activated, then there's something more that's asked of you. And then this, to me, is where it really begins, you could say. And this is largely based on the work of one of my main teachers, Stephen Jenkinson. And he has this beautiful way of imparting this understanding of interdependence on a level, though, that is, one hand, both devastating, but also utterly beautiful. And I can offer a piece of that.
Please.
Well, let's see if I can do it justice. So at a certain point, he says that the most calamitous understanding that can visit upon a human is everything that keeps you alive and has kept you alive up until this moment, the moment of your actual understanding of that. And, you know, it goes beyond someone who maybe can try to get out of it by being vegetarian or vegan or something. Or there's ways that people can try to sort of posit themselves that essentially that they can exist without other beings having to die. And he doesn't say it with any sort of moral judgment. It's not like saying, you know, therefore you're an evil person. It's just saying that's how life is. That if you look at all the bacteria that, you know, died and decomposed and became the soil, and then, you know, and the air that you breathe, and I mean, more obvious examples of, you know, the oil that you're burning in the car, which all of it, maybe you don't have a car then, right? But again, all of the other pieces of existence and the trees and the other animals, that all of it, that there's a built into the very structure and the fabric of existence is that life can only exist on the death of other life. And as a human, you realize, one, how utterly dependent you are, as every being is, upon this entire mechanism. But to take it back to what I was saying previously about uncovering your life gifts and your purpose, you realize at a certain point that who is your life for? Or you could say, to what do you owe your life, when your entire existence has been based upon the death of all of the other things that have died for you, consciously or unconsciously. And that is meant to invoke a sense of indebtedness. And it's not meant to be like, again, like a mortal sin or something you feel bad about, right? That would be a very misunderstood way of taking that in. Because hopefully what it does to you, again, is one, drops you into a level of grief. But grief and joy are so intertwined. You know, you can drop into grieving, and there's a richness there of that territory, which is very different than sadness or despair, which is a bleak, dark hole. But grief can be a very beautiful place to reside, and it's, you know, he has this great line that it is the cradle of your ability to love life. And so when you get to that point of being an activated human being and discovering your gifts and, you know, putting your talents now to work, who is the work for? And who is your life for? What is your life for? So then that means to me that your purpose then becomes, how do you participate in that whole process? And for me personally, how does that translates into, how do I make beauty? How do I make beautiful things as an offering back to that which has kept me alive?
So for you personally, how has your past sort of, how have you evolved to this point?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let me think about that. It's a big question again.
When did you start seeing this fellow?
Stephen?
Yeah.
I began studying with him in August 2012.
And what led you to him?
Well, actually, a mutual friend had been studying with him for a number of years, and she'd said, you got to meet this guy. And I was like, well, what's he all about? And she's like, I can't. She couldn't translate. She's like, you just got to go meet him. And I was like, all right. So I met, and yeah.
So what was your philosophy before that? What was your general philosophy of living?
I mean, yeah, it's interesting because I've actually done this practice where I almost write the story of your perspective, or personal perspective. Like I can go and track actually how my understanding of, you could call it the philosophical understanding, but really your life, how both the purpose and the understanding changed over time. And I actually recommend it for anybody. It's a very, because you can see like, oh, that's where I learned this particular perspective or shift that then led to this. So I can actually go back and see like the journey. And I think for me, and I think this is actually becoming more common, is a lot of people talk about awakening from this, that it has to come from hitting rock bottom. It has to come from a dark night of the soul, it has to come from, and I think a lot of people have stories of that kind of thing, like they weren't able to make shifts or to see things differently until, you know, everything had been taken away or whatever it was. And I think, you know, I didn't have a story like that. I don't have anything that was catastrophically impacting my life. But I think a lot of newer people coming in the further generations don't necessarily need to go through that anymore. And I think it's because of those that went through it in the previous generations are now imparting that wisdom in different ways down. And now, you know, it doesn't become, there's not as much of a revelation as it is an accepted, into the dominant culture. And so profound work has been done by others. And so for me personally, I mean, I hit, I think the end of the general middle class existence, in the suburbs of Canada or British Columbia. And, I got to the point where I really had to ask that question, like, was this it, really? Like, this is all that the dominant culture can offer? And that, I hit that, around 18 or 17 or 18. And I was like, okay, there has to be something more, because clearly this can't be it. And I went traveling, went to university, and like perhaps many, I hit Buddhism for the first time in the 20s, my early 20s. And just the basic understandings of, how your mind perceives the world will then create your reality. These types of non-dualistic understandings, all of that started coming in then, and of course that blew my mind in different ways. And then I also understood, of course, that, not to the level of indebtedness that I'd been talking about, but that the systems of the dominant culture are themselves built upon deep separation between that which you see and that which you don't see. That there's a very significant shadow side of the modern economy and all of its systems that, once you start peeking in, it's like you can't unsee it. And different people react in different ways. Some become more militant in their activism, and I would start participating in street protests and that kind of stuff, and looking at different ways of civil disobedience and things. But I found, I quickly became, I think, disillusioned, not so much with that particular path itself, but that still felt incomplete. Like when in 2004, I believe, I first hit the concept of peak oil. And then again, that started asking questions like, well, civilization can't exist even as it is for that much longer without really needing to tap into, extreme forms of extraction, extreme forms of commodification. And that, you hit it, like that, if that was a existential moment, or if that was mine, then that was it. Basically, when you come to that revelation, like, okay, well, civilization actually can't continue as it is. And a lot of people don't get out of that. A lot of people then will half-heartedly participate in things like activism and stuff like that, but it's really a bleak place to stay, and it's not generative. Like, it won't keep you going that much longer. And I know a lot of people like that are coming from that. But I would say then beyond that, once you get through it, you realize, well, what is your role now in this time of massive shift? And essentially, this is now informed by the work of Stephen Jenkinson again, that what is our role at the time of the dying of the dominant culture and the dying of the civilization? And it's not asking us to, hate it as it goes down, because the dominant culture gave a lot of us so much. And again, built upon deep shadow and deep pain of a lot of others. But at the same time, there's many beautiful things that I think need to be recognized and grieved and honored at the same time as it's let go. And so, I continued on from this, okay, how do I really participate at this time? I hit the work of Charles Eisenstein, which beautifully detailed how deep this cultural story actually goes, which was, exactly what I needed to hear at the time. And for me, I also fused my love of film and very much just an amateur, skill, and I really put it to work towards, well, how could I be of service through this medium? And then that started my work with Velcro Ripper, who's another filmmaker, a well-known Canadian filmmaker who does documentaries on spiritual activism, is one term. Or you could say soul force, or essentially fusing activism with this grounded level of being and interdependent awareness. And that, to me, was the other missing piece that I think is becoming more and more common. A lot of people get that. Occupy Love was a film that we produced together, which really looked at the Wall Street movement. And he was filming from day one down on Wall Street in September 17th, 2011. And he found right away that there was something different, that, there was a meditation tree and there was nonviolent communication workshops, as much as there was civil disobedience training and all the rest of it, that all of it was just emergent and it was there. And for us who had been tracking this sort of emergence, that we saw it right away. And that's what we tried to get across in our film. And now we're kind of at the point where we're looking at, okay, well, what's next in terms of both, personal ability to create change as media makers, and also how do we understand how change actually happens? And that to me is the edge where I'm at now.
Yeah, that's one of my questions too. How do you actually create change? Because that's my whole thing too. But love, I'll go to love. How would you describe love? I think love is one of those words like God that it's so overused, and everyone's got their own idea of it because it's based upon their own understanding of things. Mm-hmm. How would you personally describe what love is?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me think here. I think love itself is the understanding and the expression of interdependence. That you can include others, or you include the systems that we're dependent upon. You can include other beings. You can include all of that into what you count as part of you, and not in a way that therefore they're somehow owned by you. Like this idea of, oh, everything is a reflection of me, but as a understanding is, again, this dependence issue, that we're mutually arising, which again is a Buddhist concept, that I can't exist without them, and they can't exist without me. And so that creates this true, compassionate web with which to create our systems and actions. And, we get hints of that through things like, the 99% versus the 1%. A lot of people saw that in the Occupy movement as sort of this us versus them. But I think part of it was understanding that you can condemn the actions, but not the individuals, because they're just as human, they're just as embedded within, if not more so, within the structures of power. Charles Eisenstein has a beautiful line about, we look at the systems and we say, oh, there must be a cabal, shadowy group that's controlling all the strings and things. But he's more of the mind that it's very likely that those much more deeply embedded within the system are therefore even more blind to the actions and the implications of the actual decisions, and are just as swayed by the momentum of the system itself. So he says we're all puppets, but there's no puppet masters. And so for me, that's also part of this understanding that love itself needs to be reclaimed from this understanding of that love only is love if it benefits you, which is a very common understanding, particularly around in personal relationships, right? That, love and hate are not opposites. I would say infatuation and hate are intertwined, because you can't, if you truly love something, you cannot hate it. And that misunderstanding is deeply ingrained in, I think, our conceptions of the self, and trying to use other people to get our needs met all the time. And that's where the confusion comes in, because if your love is only dependent upon somebody else's ability to fulfill your needs, that's not love. And in particular, this year, my partner and I went through a separation that was, at one hand, utterly devastating, but on the other hand, very beautiful. And I defer again to Stephen Jenkinson when he says that you cannot truly, it's not truly love until you also love something's end. If you see a flower and you can love the flowering of the flower, and that's easy. But can you also love the end of the flower? And the flower going back into the earth and the flower becoming something else that's beautiful. That to me is a full understanding of what love is. And so the challenge today is a lot of people sense this, right? They sense that, again, existing only as an independent being is a very lonely place. And furthermore, it's not even true that we're utterly dependent. And so how do we build our systems to reflect this? How do we shift our actual policies of our society and all of it to reflect that understanding. And I think it's very possible. But it's difficult to see if you can only see the reflection of human nature based upon the current systems and the current story. And that's where the disconnect happens for a lot of people.
So that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, to me, is how do you help somebody to see the world like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, and what I've found is I would intuitively do some certain things in specific situations, such as hug somebody, and in particular, I might do a film screening, or I might be at an event, and somebody I could see, has a certain understanding of maybe who I am, or approaching me from a certain perspective of like, oh, okay, I guess I have to be this way, maybe very formal, like, oh, can I shake your hand type thing, and I'll be like, do you want a hug? And they'll be like, yeah. And you immediately see, though, that created a disconnect between their expectation of how to behave, or what the role was, and the connection that could take place. And that's a very simple example, of course. But it was later that Charles Eisenstein actually articulated beautifully this understanding of most people think that people base their opinions on facts, and they make the best decision based upon very solid understanding. But it's not true. We base it upon the stories that we want to believe are true. And so you can actually deliberately create situations that introduce cognitive dissonance between their understanding of what's supposed to happen and what actually does happen. And so you can create these very specifically, and occupy tons of beautiful examples of this. One very specific one is simply people in a park that wouldn't leave, right? For a lot of people, they couldn't understand that, because if the dominant systems were working fine, or for those that say, there's tons of jobs out there, these hippies just don't want to work, this type of stuff. The longer they stayed in the park, the longer the dissonance held the tension between what people wanted to believe, like what they were there. It came across as, what are your demands, or what are your demands? Like, if you don't have demands, you don't deserve to be there. And, all this stuff, trying to figure it out, when just simply staying there was creating so much tension that people couldn't figure it out. And that, to me, catalyzed a lot of shift for a lot of people. Because if you can introduce that Carlos Castaneda, in his books, Don Juan, has a great line, calls it stopping the world. If you can stop the world, which is the unconscious, ongoing, scripts that people have running, if you can somehow stop those, even for a brief moment, you create, I think, a beautiful space with which to insert new understandings about how the world actually could be.
Do you believe there is a God or a supreme intelligence?
Let me think about that for a second, too. I think a supreme intelligence is emergent. And by that meaning, it's not reducible. You can't reduce it, even though all of the pieces might reflect fractally the essence of the whole. I don't believe that there is an endpoint of a single congealed entity of itself that could be seen as a supreme intelligence, versus an emergent property of the interdependence of all of the pieces working at the same time. And so, I think questions of what I would call more from an evolutionary perspective, people like Andrew Cohen, people like basically that posit, therefore, then the trajectory of the universe, or the trajectory of it all, is to create more consciousness, or at least like push forward the complexity and the understanding to reach perhaps that endpoint of complete awareness of that being. And I think that it's a very interesting position that I'm saying I like it a lot, which is why I suspect that there might be even something more. Basically saying that because I can only grapple with that from the perspective of myself as an individual being that wants to do that wants to actually take my own life and make it a story of, you know, less complexity to more complex conscious awareness. And so I'm very wary of that. There's a possibility that I'm actually then projecting that onto the universe itself and saying, well, that's the story. So I guess I'm saying is I really like that, and which makes me suspicious. And I don't necessarily know what, therefore, an alternative necessarily would be. I do know that there's a lot unseen that in the unseen realms that, I mean, I'll just say there's a lot more that I don't know, and that the story, you call it maybe the grand story, is itself, I think, unfathomable, certainly from the human perspective, but not necessarily that doesn't mean it's paralyzing to not be able to grasp the whole unfolding story, because it does, the very fact that it's ungraspable then asks specific things of you, as in, how do you make the story go on? What does it mean to actually understand yourself as part of the story, and also that the story cannot go on without you?
Do you believe you have free will? That humans have free will?
Short answer, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I believe that it depends, again, though, what you consider to be free will, necessarily. That, you know, a lot of what I study is pattern recognition. In particular, studying potentials, and how do you navigate the potential field from the point of a single conscious perspective. And I believe that as all potentials themselves are available, that, you know, if you look at, if all the universe came from a, you know, tiny little dot, at some point, all of the potentials of the universe had to have existed within that point before the universe expanded into being. And that, therefore, there's no potential that is not available. But the trick is, of course, you as a single point in that potential field have to collapse potentials into your own experience. And for me, that is where free will comes in. So that your consciousness itself is the ability to collapse waveform potentials into your single experience. And so, the challenge then becomes, okay, well, how do I read through the potential field and actually say, okay, I want to activate that potentials versus I don't really want to go down those, even though all of them are actually happening. And so the skillfulness then becomes, well, stories themselves impact our ability to navigate the potential field, because we'll make certain potentials true. And this is why I think, questions of, things like good and evil, and are we trying to create a world without evil, that the dualistic mind itself can't grasp how the very nature of asking those types of questions generate their opposites. So, to posit, well, we want to create a world of more good, immediately generates that evil itself is the opposite of good. And so there's a danger, of course, of seeing the world in that trajectory, that somehow that's what we're trying to create, as opposed to this more holistic understanding of how do we integrate light and shadow, good and bad, and all these different types of things from a level of skillfulness, and harangue them into a culture that understands both of them and the necessity for both. This is why I think the us versus them and all that stuff is missing the point, because the us versus them is itself based upon an understanding of separation. But that's not to say that, therefore, the oneness, which is the sort of ultimate goal posited by a lot of the particularly those more of a spiritual nature, will say, well, it's ultimate oneness that we need to get back to and all this stuff. But again, that's, to me, oneness typically means then this world of good, or this utopic world of good. But all of the old cultures did not, they didn't perceive that there was a world of ultimate good. They had ways of grappling with shadow, of grappling with, they never called it evil, though. They would call it just simply the polarities between which all of life sweeps.
What I believe, we are creators. We are the creator. and we could create anything. And Buddhists have created this paradigm. Tim and Leary's have created that paradigm. Everybody's created their own possibilities. I ask all these people, are we capable of this, this, or this? And it's surprising that some people will say, no, you can't do this. You can really see, when you talk to these people who are actually the leaders of their archetypes in some way, that there are limitations. It's just interesting to see how everybody's locked in their own, like you say, stories. You know,
well, I actually have a thought on that, actually. I have a thought on that. I think, I mean, you know, my parents too, they grew up, I mean, they're boomers as well, and that there was I think, a trauma that happened around the nuclear age, that there was and of course World War II and, you know, all these 20th century horrors, which really I think brought about the disillusionment to most people of this idea of modernity and, you know, humans getting better and better and on into the future. And I think that for the trauma, though, essentially I think can be traced to that the universe is meaningless. And that is a trauma, to really feel that that's true, because, and that is not something that's inherent. I do not believe you're not born with that. I think you're born tuned to this understanding that the universe is a magical place. I mean, it's filled with a lot of things you don't understand, certainly at that age. And not to say it's, you know, love and fuzzy animals all over the place. It can be quite a violent place as well, but that it is not inherently meaningless. And I think the trauma of the 20th century was upon those generations. They would see the horrors, they would see concentration camps, they would see, and they could not understand, they could not fathom that that was possible. That if there was a God, why would he have let that happen? And so the opposite of that was to turn away and to say, well, then there must not be a God. And therefore, how do we get by, you know, now without God? And you can see that it's a reaction to something. So it's not a position that can be, I think, maintained without keeping at bay all of the other pieces that often ask different questions of you. I mean, and then of course the 60s I think came along, and then the 60s themselves being a reaction to things like the conformity of the previous generations and the experimentation. And again, but you know, I see a pendulum swinging even further. But you know, you see things like what was the fellow with LSD? Not Leary, but the other fellow, the one that basically was like everybody should do LSD all the time. And you know, I mean, I saw a documentary, and you're kind of like, wow, there's a lot of unskillfulness around these new psychedelics and things that came in and blew open, you know, the third eye and the chakras of everybody. But of course, then that led to, you know, the shadow of all of that unskillfulness around usage. And I would say the pendulum swinging back, you know, too far too soon hits the establishment and Kent State and all that other stuff, you know, society cracking down. And it swung back in the 80s, you know, 90s, very affluent decades. And now I think the pendulum is swinging once again. But pendulum, to me, used to be a useful metaphor, but now I see it as a spiral. That in fact we're spiraling back around now with all of this understanding that came from those previous generations, understanding how much of it is reactionary to what happened in those previous generations, and then swinging back around to a more holistic and rich understanding of all the pieces that need to be in place. I mean, I would say that that's essentially where we're at now. That you know, people like to. I meet a lot of boomers who are actually fairly cynical, actually, about the 60s and what happened and all this stuff. And, you know, I say, you guys did an amazing job. And a lot of what we take for granted now was because of those generations. And at the same time, we still need you. We still need you sharing all that was learned from, you know, building consensus-based decision-making, working with groups, and, you know, holding space. And, like, that generation had no elders for a lot of what they did. But now, our generation needs them as our elders moving forward and creating real significant shifts.
But it seems to me that we're still locked into this loop. Mm-hmm. Do you see that the future is actually might shift to something totally new?
Well, it depends what you mean by totally new.
Well, the new story. Because you're right, the story of pain and suffering is an old story, and our history is full of it. Our recorded history. Who knows what happened when all of a sudden we started recording things? I think that's when we really lost God, is when we started actually having to write things down. We've lost whatever abilities that we had to have oral histories, or whatever abilities that Don Juan, through thousands of years, their culture tried to manifest through different aspects of their awareness. Mm-hmm. We took something and totally turned it into a reflection of ourselves. Mm-hmm. How do you see all that? Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I would say part of what I'm learning now with Stephen is actually, what happens when you write something down. And you're right, what happens is it becomes the story as opposed to a story, right? And immediately you can see how the concretization of a story now becomes the thing which others can hold up and use, and you get the Bible, right? Where it's like, this is the truth, as opposed to, you know, the telling of the story itself within a certain group or culture itself that has the power. And so I would say that's a highly misunderstood trade-off that has certainly been part of what you could just call the increasing separation that has gone on over the last, you know, certainly by the agricultural revolution, the shift from hunter-gatherer nomadic to agricultural civilization, the structures as we know it. But as far as, you know, where we're at today in terms of being locked in a loop, I think, yes, you know, we're seeing this oscillation between polarities, but at the same time, we are seeing, well, let me just say that the dominant culture's perception of time is that it's linear, right? That we have this idea that past, present, future. So the future comes to us, we experience it in the present, and then the past is gone. And there's a real danger with that understanding, which I think is not well understood, but it's also what is the basis for all of understandings about progress in society. That, in fact, civilization itself is this journey from, you know, the past, less complexity, less consciousness, say, to more and more increasing awareness, increasing consciousness. You know, another similar story, of course, Singularity. You know, we're reaching this point of artificial intelligence, creating exponential growth. All of those stories can be mapped on an understanding of time, that we're going from somewhere to somewhere. But that's, it's a very specific type of time, and a lot is missing from that story. Because if you start to see, one, that the universe itself operates upon this oscillation between polarities, but not only that, it's not an exact revolution, or it's essentially exactly around the same circle each time. Because what I think is a more appropriate map of the universe is, in fact, the spiral. Because the spiral is a revolution, but with time added back in. So time is actually the factor that makes sure that it is not the exact same when it comes back around again between the polarities. And that this, to me, is what I'm starting to understand is that is the core indigenous understanding of time. That the cycles themselves are based upon these continually reoccurring journey between the polarities. And yet time itself is not something that then flows to you and then is past and is gone. That's where the understanding of ancestries come from. That they're present, they're not gone. The very idea that your ancestors are gone and somehow, you know, never again is, it's a very different understanding, and it's a very lonely understanding, actually. I would say that all of the connections, all the interdependent connections themselves, all of your ancestors, all of even the future generations are actually all present in the present. That should change then how you make certain decisions, how you navigate certain potentials, how the culture holds together, how they tell their stories. Because if that actually was true in a lived way, we'd make very different decisions. And you can see why this intimate tie to a place is of such importance to somebody who has achieved indigenousness versus somebody who's not. Because it's very hard to understand what that even means when, for instance, you're always trying to make the past gone. And you can see now, you know, if you look at probably in the collective unconscious of the dominant culture, particularly places like Hollywood, you see a obsession with this idea of apocalypse, which I also see as essentially a desire to hit reset. That this idea that, you know, we can kind of wipe the slate clean, that, you know, humanity, we made a mistake somewhere, you know, and best thing to do is toss it all in the gutter and start over, right? And the very idea of starting over is so bizarre to anybody that has an understanding of ancestors and present, that they're present. And starting over would be akin to saying, I didn't come from anywhere, and completely shunning everybody that came before you, which, you know, is blasphemy from an indigenous understanding. Well, I maybe I'll just add that I could differentiate between like a cultural people, that people are held together by shared culture, like a distinct culture, which, what does that look like? Knowing the same songs, you know, having shared stories, knowing that you come from somewhere, both in place and in those people, in your ancestors, that, again, yeah, may not necessarily be your direct descendants, but that there's a understanding of you belong to the people, that tribe. And then there's the, as you say, maybe more energetic, or like a, you know, the specific experiences that happened that continue to ripple forward. And I will say that for me, one of the most exciting films or memes, you could say, that has hit the mainstream in recent years was Cloud Atlas, the film Cloud Atlas, which, not surprisingly, was done by the Matrix crew. And for me, that one is an incredible storytelling attempt to essentially what I believe to be tell a story from an indigenous understanding of time being collapsed in on itself, of multiple times happening all at the same time. Understanding that, and understanding the cyclical nature between them, and then the mapping of how events themselves ripple through generations to continue to affect far into the future and far into the past. That to me is very different from the dominant culture's understanding both of cause and effect and of the hero. Both of those stories are themselves based upon one, to conceive of a hero, you need to have an understanding of, or a deep belief in independence to be a hero, right? And you can see that is the Hollywood archetype, that an individual triumphs over certain things and saves the day, or, you know, achieves the goal, or gets the girl, or whatever it is. And that is a very limited understanding of how much you're actually dependent upon everything around you. And that I think we're starting to see new structures actually entering the mainstream about, and particularly at the level of story, which is why Cloud Atlas is a phenomenal example of that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was great.